Hello and welcome to another episode of our show 28.4 FM, connecting India's youth to the world. On today's episode, I'm joined by my co-host from Delhi, Rishika Arora. And today is a special episode because we're going to be talking about a country that many of you probably can't locate on a map, but maybe you should because of how cool it is and how amazing its initiatives are, especially in the field that we're most interested in, which is governance. So this is a country which basically lives online. And I know that most of you are thinking, okay, all of us are always living online because of the pandemic, but this is a country that's been living online for the best part of 2 decades at this point of time. From health records to online voting, almost every important part of a citizen's relationship with the state is conducted online with minimal sort of in-person interactions. So this is basically the state that was that was designed best for a pandemic like COVID-19, and just in general, obviously. Um, just if you can think about being able to cast a vote online, think about being able to access your health records online, think about making all your government appointments and all your government ID applications online, and the savings, the efficiency, the lack of corruption that comes along with it because you're not interacting with a person. And so we thought we'd bring you a guest from this country itself. And the country we're talking about is Estonia, which is a country of 1 million in Northern Europe. It's a part of the European Union. And it is basically the most advanced digital society in the world. And our guest is actually from Estonia. Mr. Florian Marcus is joining us today from Tallinn, Estonia. And he is a digital transformation advisor. And he's going to tell us the story of Estonia's digital society. So, Mr. Florian Marcus, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for the opportunity of talking to you. And of course, hi to the audience as well.
So let's get right into the topic, which is of utmost importance both here in the United States and in India. We have upcoming elections in both these countries, and a lot has been spoken about how these elections are going to be conducted sort of on in person during a pandemic. What's it like looking at this sort of situation from Estonia?
Of course, there are several layers of incredulity towards those elections, particularly in the US. If you look at the political climate over there right now, in terms of the way that you would organize an election, there are discussions about how to do postal voting, how to do voting in person at the polling stations, and so on. It is very hard to relate to for Estonians because in Estonia, i-voting has been available to the population since 2005 for local elections, for national parliamentary elections, and also for the European parliamentary elections. I'm actually not Estonian, I'm German, but still I get to vote online for the European parliamentary elections and so on. And I guess the big question that Estonians ask every now and then to foreign political decision makers, and where we're still waiting for an answer, is why don't you make online voting one of your options? Why? I mean, nobody's forcing you to conduct everything online. We're not conducting everything online. We still have paper voting if you want to vote on paper. We're not forbidding it or something. But certainly to have it digitally available, which I think also makes a lot of sense in the context of COVID-19, of course. Earlier in April, we had 2 elections in Europe. We had one referendum in Italy on the constitution that was cancelled for obvious reasons. And then in France, we had the mayoral elections across the country that were continued to be held, putting the health of the population at risk. And I think especially in a scenario like COVID-19, there are only bad options when it's about physical voting. Either you stop the processes of democracy, which has its own problems, or you put the health of your whole nation at risk, because obviously you want people to vote. So why we can't offer online voting as one of the alternatives is quite incomprehensible to many Estonians when they look at the rest of the world.
So one thing I sort of want to prod is the question of why don't you consider online voting? Because like an intuitive response to that is security issues or like establishing trust. So when Estonia was going through this transformation, was there any inhibition to creating like a digital state? What questions were raised with regards to security and how were they tackled?
So Estonia had one advantage. When it regained independence from the Soviet Union in 1991, actually on my birthday, uh, the government had the chance to rebuild its bureaucratic infrastructure from the ground up because the Soviet Union had just left. And Estonia used that chance more so than many other countries, also in the Baltic states, sort of post-Soviet nations. So that allowed us also to build everything up with security in mind from the very beginning. Estonia put a lot of focus and hard work into the notion of maintaining and improving or increasing the trust of the society. Well, how do you gain trust? I think that's actually a very interesting question. Bearing in mind that countries around the world, governments around the world, have gambled away their people's trust over the last few years, whether it's in India regarding the Aadhaar numbers, or whether it's the social security numbers in the US, it's the same story. So in Estonia, we created very early on this secure electronic identity. That means that identity theft is extremely difficult to pull off. That means it's really hard to hack your identity in some ways. And then, so through that general trust foundation, iVoting became one of the earlier online services, actually, before a comprehensive e-health system was actually implemented. And I think the realization there was twofold. Number one, before online voting was possible for the population, the cabinet members were already able to vote online on parts of the agenda of the meetings. So they thought, why don't we do that for the rest of the country? And that's a fair question. And the second point is that also to this day, people or countries around the world that run elections on paper, they like to question the veracity, the reliability of the digital voting procedures, but they don't look at their paper voting procedures and think, could we do something wrong with this as well? How could we abuse this system right now? And whether it's about electronic ballot machines in the US, or whether it is about who does the vote counting in India, like it's a random third person that you have to trust that they're counting your vote the way you cast it. It's an extremely remote and uncontrollable system, especially at the scale of India. So why exactly we trust the offline version, but would never put our trust in an online system? I think some people have to answer those questions as well. Can you create unsafe online systems? Absolutely. If you do it, if you build it up in the wrong way, if you don't even have a secure digital identity to start with, then the whole procedure will be flawed, most likely. And this is what we see around the world right now. But it is possible to have secure online elections, and we've had that for 15 years now. So it's going well.
This is really fascinating to me. So let me just break it down. How does it work on election day? Do you have sort of a voter ID or that's what we have in India, but how, like, walk us through the process of actually casting your vote? What does it look like?
Sure. So in Estonia, everybody has an electronic identity. It's connected to a personal code. It's comparable to the Aadhaar number. How many digits does your number have? It's probably a few more than ours. We've got 11 digits.
We've got 9, I think.
Okay. Well, ours is longer, I guess. Fair enough. So all the personal data that the government stores about you in different databases in different ministries and authorities is connected to that personal code, as we call it. Then there are different types of electronic ID carriers. This could take the form of an electronic ID card, so it's just the physical identity card. It could also be an app called Smart ID. It could also be a SIM card called Mobile ID that you can get from any network provider in the country. And connected to those different eID carriers, there are 2 PIN codes. The first one is to log in, sort of authentication. And the second PIN is the digital legally binding signature, which you would also use later in the voting process. So what happens? You would have to have some sort of eID carrier, whether it is the ID card or the mobile ID SIM card. And you would also have to download the voting application on a laptop, on a computer, something like that. Then you would authenticate yourself with your electronic ID, with your PIN 1 as well. And then you would see all of the different candidates that are running in your district. You would choose your candidate, and then you click vote, and then you enter your PIN 2, and then it's done. So, and after that, you have a confirmation page where it also shows you a QR code. The QR code you can scan with your phone to see whether the vote, the way you gave it, arrived unchanged at the voting server. So maybe there was someone who tried to intercept your vote for some reason, and that way you can make sure that that did not happen. The big question for many governments when they talk to us is, how can the government be sure that I, as the voter, was not forced or bribed to vote for a different candidate? No, maybe one of you guys was sitting behind me holding a gun to my head. How can we make sure that that doesn't happen? Well, first of all, I think you're nice folks, so I'm pretty sure you wouldn't. But we also have another point that's very important. So, Abhishek, you mentioned at the very start that on election day, we don't really have an election day. We rather have an election week. So every election in Estonia is 10 days long. The first 7 days are online. So during those 7 days, you can vote as many times as you want, and only the last vote counts. So, for example, you can hold a gun to my head. I show you that I vote for your candidate rather than for mine. And then you leave my house because you have to force many, many people to vote for your candidate. And then I just change my vote. Yeah. And so after that 7-day online voting period, there's a 2-day break where everything is sort of calculated. And then we have a final voting day on paper at the polling stations around the country. And if you cast your vote on paper on voting day, then it also overrides whatever you did online. So the paper vote still technically trumps the digital vote if you decide to vote in both ways for ballot secrecy reasons. But yeah, that's how it works. And then, so for me, last year we had the European Parliamentary elections, and it took me a minute online, and then I let my fiance vote on the same laptop with her electronic identity, and yeah, that's it.
And perhaps this is by virtue of how well you explained this, but it sounds like a fairly easy to understand process. And when we talk about online services, 2 questions that are often brought up are digital literacy and accessibility. Does everyone have access to the internet? Does everyone have access to an electronic device? So in Estonia, how is this access sort of promised? How is the universal franchise extended to every single member of society?
Sure. So in general, internet is seen as a social right, meaning that many public places, public spaces and so on, they offer free Wi-Fi without any login or something like that. People are still responsible for having their own electronic devices, although I think these days it's fair to say that most people have one. In Estonia, we also have 98% 4G coverage in the entire country. So it's pretty easy to sync up. To be honest, yes, that was easier for Estonia to achieve than it is for India for geographical reasons. Not just size, but also the nature of the terrain is a bit more challenging in India, I suppose. About digital literacy, this is actually one core component that we need to talk about when we discuss digitalization. I think part of the key lies in education, that you teach people this is what a computer looks like, that's a mouse click, this is Google Chrome, and here's how you save a Microsoft Word document or something. So that's just basic skills. But the question is, also, even if you know how to get to the government website, are you tempted to use their services? And when many governments around the world think about digital services, I think in their heads, it's primarily how can we transfer the paper process to a digital format, but sort of like a one-to-one conversion. So in terms of a tax declaration, or you have to fill in the same things, but it's now on a PDF, you know? And then they're surprised that nobody's using it because you're not offering them any benefits. You don't make it easier, you don't make it faster, you don't make it cheaper. Why would they use it? And then people are surprised. I think what we've understood quite quickly in Estonia is that user friendliness and the sort of the service journey plays an incredibly big role in the usage rates of digital services. So when we talk about online voting, in the last elections, out of all the votes that were cast, 46.7% were cast online voluntarily. So it's almost like a 50-50 split between paper and digital. But most importantly, one of the biggest voting groups online is aged 55 plus.
Wow.
So the elderly are actually quite interested in this system because if we think about it objectively, the elderly have way more incentives to use that system. You know, maybe statistically, the elderly tend to live in more rural areas. Statistically, the elderly have more physical impairments that might keep them from going to the physical polling station. So they have much more reason to use those systems online. Number one, if they have a device. Number two, if they can connect to it, like through the internet. And number three, if they know how to use all of those different services, if they are user-friendly. And I think if you check these three boxes with any country, if you invest into education, if you invest into sort of a connectivity rollout, and then also the user-friendly aspect, I think digitalization is only a matter of time, and also for the population to really seriously pick it up.
I want you to touch on the decentralization of this process, because elections are inherently politically controlled events, whether they're in India or in the US, in the sense that you have a political entity running the polling booth. In the case of India, we have an independent body, but that comes with its own issues. So how do you remove the political control over this process? Because I'm sure our viewers and listeners probably are wondering what happens if the government takes over this process and just casts votes willy-nilly on behalf of the ruling party.
Well, first of all, you have to make sure that you don't create a system where it is that easy to just willy-nilly take over the voting system.
Yeah.
The other aspect is, yes, we have an independent body, and we have, so that one sort of is responsible for the supervision of the elections, of the black box server where the tabulation of the votes will actually happen. But we also have very much a partisan body that oversees the elections. But, and this is a very important but, there is always a representative of every single party present in parliament. So it's not just the government that's, 80% of the votes came in for us. What a great surprise. It's all the opposition parties will be present. And of course, also international observers, just like in most other democracies, we let those people in because we think we all benefit from that. And quite importantly for them, online voting also makes their job easier because you don't have to be in every single polling station around the country, and the bigger the country, I mean, thinking about how many international election observers go to India, that must be thousands of people just to make sure that in every single state and in every single district, the processes are more or less legitimate. But if you have around 50% of all votes cast on one server, then yeah, you just have to wait in that room and oversee the process there. So it makes it more reliable in that way as well.
I guess just a small follow-up. So would you say that the prevalence of digital services and of course digital voting, does it in any way contribute to what most of the youth in the country pursue. And I guess what I'm trying to sort of get at is, in what ways do young students who might be choosing what to major in or what to like pursue in general, in what ways do they contribute to sort of holding up this digital infrastructure?
So bearing in mind that Estonia has developed this digital reputation over the last 20 years or so, IT studies are incredibly popular in Estonia, relatively speaking. In Estonia, every 10th student at university studies something IT related, which is pretty strong. And not just programming, but also cyber and IT law, e-governance, change management. So like everything that is connected to those processes overall, I think is quite fascinating and important. Something else that has, of course, those digital services, yes, they engage the population, but I think the Estonians also take it for granted because they've been like, some generations have not seen any other systems. My fiance is Estonian. She has never voted on paper. So for me, coming in as a German, I have a completely different appreciation of the system as she does. For her, it's always been that way. So I don't think it contributes so much in that way. What I do think is that the Estonian government, because it is so flexible, so agile, and willing to innovate all the time, the Estonian government has become a very attractive employer, actually, which in most countries isn't really the case. If you think, I don't know, if you're at a party and you're talking to someone and you ask, well, what do you do for a living? And they say, oh, I work for the government. It's usually like, oh, you must be fun, you know, sort of, you're waiting for your career to die, sort of. Whereas I think in Estonia, there's a very healthy exchange of experience and knowledge between the private and the public sector. And I think that helps both sides. Both sides benefit from this. The government benefits because of all the innovation, and the private sector side benefits from having awareness of all the legislation that might frame your product that you're thinking of, or your startup solutions. So I think it's useful for both sides, really.
Coming to the developing world, people from there are watching this interview and say, okay, this is a great idea. It works in Estonia. Estonia is, $20,000 per person per capita income, rich country. What would some of the learnings for these developing countries be for e-governance? I mean, when I think of a country like India, I mean, to lock, stock, and barrel take e-voting from Estonia at a national scale is not possible at one time. But why not try it out at the civic levels, or in a particular city, for example? Is that how you think about learnings for the developing world?
I think before we get into the nitty-gritty details, we have to do away with the myth that digitalization is expensive. It's not at all. What is expensive is to maintain a paper-based bureaucracy with living, breathing humans for a billion people. So my argument is always, if you can afford to run a paper-based bureaucracy for around like almost a billion people in your case, you can afford a server room for a billion people. That's not the issue. So the question in the case of India, I guess, is rather, does everyone have a secure electronic identity? So to get those basics right. Actually, what we've seen with many countries around the world, for background, I'm a political scientist. So what we see is that that rich countries are usually really bad at digitalization because they don't feel the same pain that poor countries feel. Post-Soviet Estonia was between a rock and a hard place. They didn't have a lot of manpower. They didn't have a lot of money either. So they knew the only way is like to invest right now and then hope for the best. And I think the same is true for other countries. We're currently seeing some of the fundamentals that are working in Estonia. We have partnerships with Namibia and Benin in Africa, which again are not the richest country in the world. We have a cooperation with Ukraine, which by European standards is also still very much a developing economy. So don't take it as an excuse that poverty somehow might be a hurdle for digitalization to clear. The bigger challenge usually is, and we see that around the world, regardless of wealth status, is how federal is your government structure. And now when we're talking about India, of course, there's a lot of fragmentation going on.
Correct.
Just like in the US, just like Germany as well. And those countries tend to struggle a bit more with digitalization because in most instances, the government, the national government that is very reluctant to put down very clear frameworks for what are the security standards, what is the data exchange protocol that we're going to use, which authority has the right to ask what other authority for what kind of data. That's tricky stuff. So I think bearing that in mind, having pilot projects in one district in India, or maybe one federal state in India,
right.
That's already a pretty big challenge given the size of your federal states. But I think it's a good place to start, and then from that pilot project to see what works and what doesn't for your country, because you can't copy paste, one-to-one solutions from Estonia, and then see where it goes.
I mean, looking at Estonia, it feels like we're looking into the future, honestly. I mean, it feels very fitting for 2020. Like, of course, this is how things should be, but at the same time, it's also so unfathomable. How is it that that's how things should be? So just to, and sort of like to segue into our conclusion, in what ways has this been lucrative for the pandemic? In what ways has this digitalization helped Estonia navigate its way through COVID-19?
So before I answer that question, you mentioned the point that it seems sort of surprising for 2020. I think and this is an extremely sad point actually. In the private sector, I can order a pizza to your house in 20 minutes and pay online. I can book a hotel in Bangkok right now and it's going to be reserved in 2 years from now.
Yeah.
And that's normal. But somehow people around the world have gotten used to the fact that the public sector sucks. Why have we come to accept that the gap between the public and the private sector is 20 years? Yeah. I think so in a way, Estonia, yes, it deserves some praise, but Estonia, the government sector is still lagging behind the private sector by 3 years or so. We are starting to think about how we can use voice assistants. Google has figured that stuff out years ago. Yeah. So I think it's always the private sector's job to innovate with all of this, and that's good. But the public sector should not take that as an excuse to lag behind too much, but always stay a couple of years behind, but keep catching up. To answer your COVID question, of course, what's been happening around the world is tragic. It's hundreds of thousands of deaths around the world, which is of course good for no one. But on the digital agenda itself, it's been a bit of a blessing, because usually the question that people ask us is, what if these digital services fail? What if there's a power cutout, or there's server overload or something? And finally, we get to ask, well, what if the physical services break down? What if you're not allowed to go to the office anymore? Yep. So finally, we get to ask that question in the other direction. So to go in the direction of your question, the pandemic for us has been pretty straightforward. We've already had the entire e-health dataset of every single citizen and resident digitalized. So when it came to implementing a COVID test, you just had to add one more red button to the e-health system and the website. The whole data exchange worked rather, at the start, we had to develop some new infrastructure, of course, for that data exchange in particular, but the infrastructure was already existing beforehand. Talking about digital signatures, before the pandemic, the digital signature alone has saved Estonia around 2% of the GDP every single year, because we use it a lot. Yeah. So we don't do paper signatures. For me, that was also crazy when I came here. And so in that way, nothing has changed. What has changed, of course, is that we don't do physical meetings so often anymore. But the supporting mechanisms for all of that, the data exchange, the digital identity, the signatures, and so on, all of that people have already been used to for many years, and so I think that's been extremely helpful. Also, another example would be e-education, where the government declared towards the end of 1 week in March, I believe it was, I think it was like a Thursday or Friday, we're going to close all schools next Monday. And then the schools were like, oh, okay, that's fair. That's understandable. And then we already had, every school has an e-education system. All the education materials are online. So it was just a switch to the digital world. And we can hold on to this mode of interaction for another year if we have to, because it's already there. So no one's enjoying the pandemic, and also in Estonia we've had cases of infection, of course, but overall the disruption to our system has been a lot more manageable than what we see in most other countries.
I think this is like the best sort of, to use because of lack of a different word, best sales pitch for a digital society is something like this, because you keep thinking about digital society as an enhancement to your way of living, but in this instance, this is how you live, and it's entirely possible that you'll have another pandemic in 10 years. I mean, that's the surest bet that you can make. But if you had to sort of summarize sort of your take on what the biggest benefits for citizen-state relations is from a digital society in a couple of sentences, what would those be?
In the shortest form, e-government is not a gimmick, a nice to have. It is a serious improvement to your quality of life. If you can declare your taxes in 3 minutes and you can just have a coffee afterwards because you just saved several hours of work, you've saved the money on the tax advisor, and so on. If you imagine that in my 5 years here in Estonia, I have never been to a government office. You don't have to think about that part of your life anymore.
Incredible.
Full stop. So I think this is an extremely massive benefit. The bigger your country, the bigger the benefit. And the only way is digitalization, because if your country does not digitalize, your neighboring country will, and it will attract the young, the talented, and so on. This is what we see in Estonia. This is what we see with countries around the world.
I think if I had to add to that, to people listening to us, just expect better from your government. Be aspirational for a better society and for a better government. It's possible. It's not even that expensive. It just needs a little bit of vision and a lot of planning to get the execution correct. But all of us can expect better from our government. There's so much about e-Estonia that we couldn't even get to, including their e-residency program, their health records, their e-education program. And we'll link you to the website so that you can go and read up on just what it is that they've done there. And I hope that we can have Florian back in the future to talk about some of those other initiatives, because each one of them individually is so powerful, and in aggregate has just created a whole different form of society, which is completely unrelatable to either Rishika in India and to me in the US. And make no mistake about this, Estonia is ahead of the US. Estonia is ahead of many parts of Europe too in this domain.
Absolutely. If I may add one more thing to this, don't just expect more of your politicians. Become a politician. A 60-year-old man or woman does not care about digitalization because they didn't grow up with it, they weren't raised with it, and they don't use it today. Yeah. So you have to bring into politics what you care about, and no one else can do that for you.
So that's going to be our 10-second ad for every single candidate, young candidate contesting elections in India going forward. But on that note, Florian, thank you so much for joining us. While I go and Google how to become an Estonian, I think we'll wrap up there. And thanks so much again.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the good conversation, and thanks for listening.
Thank you.